Welcome everybody again to today's webinar with Stryd and INSCYD. I have Angus here from Stryd. My name is Sebastian, and today we are going to talk about running power and how to add physiological meaning to it. And I would like to start with talking a little bit why you should even care. Like why care about having physiological meaning, having physiological data together with your Stryd running power data? And to answer this question, we should look at what determines your running performance, no matter what it is, right? Finishing a marathon, having a nice experience on a trail run, or just your new best time over 5K or 10K, right? And the answer is basically what enables that, beside psychology and maybe tactics and so on and so forth. But a big portion of your performance, especially in running, is basically derived from your own individual physiology. Okay. So how does that link then to your running power and what we're going to today? Your running power, which you measure with the Stryd sensor, is basically your best measurement, your best indicator of the pure running power, running performance itself. Because the added value basically is that you do have the possibility now to be independent of speed, wind, different surfaces, so on and so forth. Okay, so when we talk about running performance, we immediately talk about running power, and this is basically where the physiology kicks back in. So the best way how to understand that is basically the running power that you measure with your Stryd, okay, that is directly linked to your performance, is basically enabled. It's basically the result of your own unique physiology, okay? And because of that, if you want to look at your running performance, and if you want to look at increasing your running power, you need to look at your individual physiology. Here are some examples of that. Let's say you are aiming for short distance runs. I don't know, a mile, 5K, whatever, something relatively short. Then some contributors from a physiological point of view to your running performance or to your power output in that run is, for example, the aerobic power, right? The longer the event, the more aerobic power contribution you have. But because we're talking short distance here, there's also a significant contribution of anaerobic power. So one goal to understand what you should be focusing in your training, should you focus more on increasing your aerobic power, anaerobic power, the first step would be to understand how your power is actually composed. How much of that is aerobic, how much of that is anaerobic, okay? Another thing could be lactate tolerance or many other metrics. It's just giving you some examples, right? So your short distance running performance is made up of some physiological metrics, or some physiological metrics are important and determine your running performance. And then when you go to more like a little bit the longer duration events, for example, 10K up to half marathon, that shifts, right? Now we are on the longer events, and now, you know, your anaerobic power becomes less and less important, but your aerobic power still is important. And a good indicator for performance, which I assume most of you will look at, is, for example, the threshold power, FTP power, right? That's a good indicator. But as soon as you already look into a half marathon, as soon as you look at events an hour or longer, you also need to look at, you know, sparing carbohydrates, because the race limiting performance is then not necessarily your threshold power, it's not necessarily aerobic power, it's not lactate tolerance or any anaerobic capacity. But when you exceed an hour, for example, one of the most limiting factors is sparing carbohydrates. And so that is a physiological metric which should be of interest for you. And this is a physiological metric which we are looking at today in this webinar. And then ultimately, many athletes are obviously interested in marathon or ultra endurance events. And there it shifts again a little bit. Still, your aerobic power is important, and that's something we're going to look at today. But then it shifts more and more to substrate utilization. Substrate utilization in terms of how much energy is coming from fat and how much energy is coming from carbohydrates, sparing those carbohydrates, taking more in terms of fueling, right? And how big are your glycogen stores, which means how much carbohydrates are actually stored in your muscle for, as acting as a fuel during the race. That is the questions you should really care about, because this is determining if you can break your new PR, if you can finish a marathon, so on and so forth. And this is just a short intro, so to speak. This is what we're going to tackle today. That's what we're going to talk about today. How do you basically take your running power data and access then those physiological data which actually determine, for example, your marathon race performance? Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to look in this webinar into your power and how your power profile or power duration profile, whatever you want to call that, how is that created? What physiological metrics determine your power output? Okay. And to start with, especially for those of you who are not, inside out familiar with the Stryd, I think it's first important to understand a little bit about what the Stryd is, what it does, and why it's so unique in terms of, measuring power and running. And with that, I would like to hand over to Angus here from Stryd to, touch on these topics.
Thank you, Sebastian. So I'm going to be talking about what Stryd is, what Stryd reports, and how it's used on a day-to-day basis. So here on the slide, we can see the Stryd pod. I'm also holding it in my hand here. So it is a pod that clips onto the laces of the running shoe. And what Stryd is capturing is it's capturing the motion of the runner's foot in 3D motion, in 3D space, and it's capturing in millimeter and millisecond precision. Stryd is also full of environmental sensors that's capturing things such as the air resistance impact on the runners. So whether the runner's running into the wind, whether the runner is running fast, all that's being captured, and it's being captured as part of the air resistance impact of the runner overcoming the the resistance that is either being generated from the environment or from their running speed. And Stryd's taking all this data in and it's reporting running power. And for people who are familiar with running power, Stryd's reporting metabolic running power versus mechanical running power. And if you want to go in depth on what Stryd is reporting and why Stryd reports metabolic power and the use cases of metabolic power over mechanical power, I encourage everyone to go to our Stryd blog found at blog.stryd.com and click on the validation tab. And we have a white paper that covers basically the purpose of metabolic power and why Stryd reports metabolic power over mechanical power. Additionally, you will also find a white paper on air resistance, on how Stryd captures the air resistance that a runner is overcoming. So now to talk about what running power is and the use cases of it. So often this conversation is framed in terms of power versus heart rate and power versus pace, where you would use power over heart rate because running power is quicker to respond to changes in effort. So for example, if you're doing an interval session and you start a more high intense interval, the heart rate's going to take a second to ramp up, or the power is going to respond immediately. And also, for example, if you're doing a long run and you're staying at a steady intensity over the course of your run, the heart rate might drift upwards due to heart rate drift, and the power will stay constant to represent your true effort you're putting forth. And when framing power in terms of pace, basically power is capturing the challenges of the environment, whether it's hills or wind, where you can use power to maintain a steady output over the course of your run versus pace that will constantly change, whether you're running up or downhill or into the wind or with the wind. That's the common framing of how running power is used, and I think that's a good framing for people who do use pace and heart rate. For someone who doesn't use pace and heart rate, if you're not using those metrics to guide your run, but rather you're just using them to, for example, analyze your run after the fact, I like to think about running power in a different way, and I put it here as succeeding in challenging conditions with running power. where, for example, if you're doing a training run on an unfamiliar course or in an unfamiliar condition, or if you're racing on a race course for the first time, and for example, even the weather conditions are unpredictable, it's going to be unknown to you. You're not going to have that experience of running in those conditions, running on the exact grades of the hills, running into the wind conditions that might be unpredictable on that day. But when you're running with Stryd, actually, you can have confidence that you're going to succeed in challenging and unknown conditions, because running power is going to automatically capture some of those conditions. The large majority of those conditions, it's going to report you a power value that you can follow from the start of your run to the finish of your run. And you're going to be able to maintain the intensity you intend to maintain over the course of that training run or race. And now to talk a bit about the Stryd ecosystem and how Stryd is used on a day-to-day basis. So the first thing you do with the power value is it guides your racing and training. So for example, when you're looking at your sports watch, and if you have, for example, a Garmin watch or an Apple Watch, we have a Stryd app that integrates with these devices, and you can load, for example, training sessions onto these watches, and you're going to receive a low target and a high target, and you're going to know how to stay in that range and target the intensity you intend to run at. And for example, also how long you need to be running, how much longer is in your current interval session, and you're basically going to have guidance from the start to the finish of your run, so you're running at the right intensity that you intend to for your training and race. The second thing that happens is all that data is sent from the watch to the Stryd ecosystem, and Stryd analyzes that data and identifies improvements. And this is done with basically a auto-calculated critical power. So for most of you might be familiar with something called functional threshold power, and critical power is functionally used the same as functional threshold power, where Stryd is automatically detecting improvements based on your running data. So here on the left side of the screen, you can see if a run is contributing to a power duration curve, and if it's contributing to the power duration curve, then you're going to receive a notification saying your critical power has updated. And from that, Stryd can update the training and racing plans so that the next time you go out and run, you have a updated plan, tailored to your fitness. So on the right side of the screen here, you receive an updated racing plan that tells you, if your power target increased, if your estimated time dropped, and then also you can also update your training plan so you're running at the right intensities for training. So when you combine all this together, basically Stryd's closing loop. You put the Stryd power meter on your shoe, you pair it with your sports watch, you go out and run. The data is pulled in the Stryd ecosystem. We analyze that data, tell you if you've improved, then update your training and racing plans the next day. And one of the big advantages of using Stryd is, since it's attached to the shoe and it's with you for every single run, it maintains the same accuracy, whether you're running on the treadmill, running outside, running on the trail, running on the track. You can basically, you can do year-round training, you continually improve. So, on the previous slide, we talked about closing the loop, and you can basically do that iteration over and over again throughout the entire year and never have a gap in your training. This is especially important for high-performance runners, but also for runners that are just looking to, continually improve, not take a step back in their training, avoid injury. For example, if Stryd's tracking your training load, it's telling you when you're entering overtraining areas. You're able to adjust your training year-round and basically always stay in a high-performance zone, always stay in a zone that's comfortable to you, and continually improve. And this is just covering what Stryd is, what running power is, and how it's used on a day-to-day basis. And this is really just the beginning. And now, Sebastian, I'm going to hand it back to Sebastian so we can talk about adding more physiological meaning to running power with INSCYD.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for this great introduction. So how does that link to INSCYD, and how can athletes and coaches profit from combination of INSCYD and Stryd? The most important thing to remember here is what Angus just explained, is that the Stryd makes you independent from the conditions you have outside. And for now, maybe talking a little bit more to coaches who use INSCYD, that so far was a little bit detached from what you would do in testing. So testing would take place, for example, in a lab condition on a treadmill, or outdoors on the track, or outdoors on the road, but under controlled conditions. But it was until now impossible to use your Stryd data with that, leave alone taking your speed-based or time and distance-based, so what is basically speed, time, and distance-based lactate test, for example, and take those numbers, those speed numbers and those data, and then give recommendations for training, for racing, fueling strategies, training zones to the athlete based on Stryd. Until now, that was not possible, but now that is actually possible. And that is independent how you use INSCYD. So you can basically do, like shown here, option 1, you can do any kind of field or lab test, okay, like you are used to do, right? You're an athlete, you go to your coach for some physiological testing, lactate profiling, and so on and so forth. Now with INSCYD, you can take this data and base all the result on Stryd running power. And what is incredible about it, it's possible even if your athlete during that test doesn't have the Stryd sensor on his or her shoes, okay? So you can, athlete comes into your lab or into the testing session, and you can test like you're used to, and the athlete says, oh, by the way, I do have a Stryd at home, or 2 weeks later, I purchased the Stryd. So you can actually, create all the reporting, all the training all based on Stryd. And the other way around, option 2, the same thing is true for doing a PPD test, which is, a power performance decoder, which basically allows athletes to do metabolic assessment remotely by themselves outdoors, incorporated into their training. So no matter, that's the takeaways here, no matter how you're using INSCYD, lab, field, lactate, no lactate, VO2 analyzer, no VO2 analyzer, only based on remote testing, no matter what, you will always be able to get all the numbers, a full metabolic profile, based on or recorded with Stryd power data, okay? So all the freedom, you can test with Stryd, you can test without Stryd, but for sure you can give training recommendations to your athlete based on Stryd power, okay? And that is a huge advantage because, again, as Angus explained, with Stryd power outdoors, you can always maintain the correct intensity, the most efficient intensity, no matter what the conditions are, okay? So what is the benefit? Okay, I would, wanted to focus primarily on not so much the technology part, on how to process data and stuff like that. For those of you who don't know that, reach out and we can show you. I wanted to focus more today on the application, like what you get out of it, okay? And we're going to talk a lot about metabolic profiles or your physiological profiles. So I first wanted to give a brief example of what that is. So what you see here is basically, one typical dashboard of all the physiological metrics that you would get out of, a running test that is based on running power, or where you use Stryd running power as your preferred metric. So you see, aerobic power, so VO2max, lab level accuracy, or in some cases it is actually measured in the lab, but for us, it doesn't matter. We are totally agnostic, as I just mentioned, totally agnostic to what your test setting is, right? You get your anaerobic power, your VLamax, your glycolytic power to be more precise. So your ability to produce energy or running power, you could say, in the glycolytic pathway. Of course, you have a threshold in terms of maximum lactate steady state, right? And then very important, again, especially for longer events, we are looking at everything that is related to substrate utilization. So you see here, top right, fat max, how much fat you can combust at a given power output. You can see here, fat max in this athlete is 471 kilocalories per hour of energy derived from fat at a running intensity of 260 watts, okay? That's just a brief snapshot on some of all the information that you get. I'm going to take some of these information now and talk about how you can apply that into training. And one part how to apply that into your training is basically to track your progress over time, okay? So one example, what will be important for you is, as I just explained, initially, for most of the events, 10K, 5K, half marathon, marathon, so on and so forth, is your aerobic capacity, your VO2max, your ability of your body to produce energy or power, right? Angus just explained, metabolic power in running, produce that the aerobic way. This is the most important energy source. And the proxy for that, the marker for that, in sports science ever since, is your VO2max, the ability, the maximum ability to combust oxygen, because with every oxygen molecule, so to speak, combusted, you produce energy or power aerobically, okay? So you can track that. Every time you do an assessment, it tracks automatically in your profile, okay? Another important understanding would be, where does your power actually come from? How much of your power output comes from aerobic versus anaerobic energy sources is what you see on the left-hand slide here. So you can see the percentage energy contribution, and that obviously changes from athlete to another. And as you train, as you go along, and as you improve, for example, let's imagine you are aiming for a marathon, half marathon race. Then what you're basically trying to do, you're trying to increase the aerobic energy contribution, right? Because it's primarily aerobic event. If, on the other hand, you would be aiming for something shorter, let's say 800 meters, then you might be more interested in, increasing the anaerobic part of the energy contribution, and therefore you want to track that. If you're running long endurance events, marathon or even longer, trail running, half marathon, you are more interested in, as I already mentioned, fat and carbohydrate combustion, also for training zones. And I'm going to show you some great examples how you can use that in training zones, actually, okay? So talking about training zones, I just brought one overview, and I want to explain you some example training zones here. We're going to look at those one by one on how you can make your training zones more efficient and really individual based on your unique physiology. What you see here is an overview of some training zones, how they would be actually created inside. And there's something what we call the training zone builder. So you are, as a coach, entirely free and independent to create whatever training zones you want based on your coaching philosophy. Let me walk you through some examples. So base training. Most of you might base their low intensity, long, slow distance endurance training on a percentage of, for example, FTP. However, a little bit smarter way to do it maybe is to base it on substrate utilization, on carbohydrate combustion, because that is a bottleneck. This is a limiting factor. It's a precious fuel, so to speak. So one way how you could define a training zone here, for example, is on the carbohydrate combustion rate of 60 grams per hour. Could be one example, okay? So in this case, it would be 204 watts. You can see carbohydrates 60 grams per hour. In this case, out of this 204 watts, 198 watts are aerobically derived and 6 watts just anaerobic. Obviously, it's long, slow distance, okay? The next training zone, one very popular one, which will be very interesting if you're training to increase your aerobic fitness, will be your fat max zone. So basically, staying in the right power zone, independent on the conditions, independent of wind, uphill running, downhill running, different surfaces that you run on. Always stay in the right power where you can be sure that you burn the maximum amount of fat. In this case, 463 kilocalories per hour. Where does it come from? That's part of your metabolic profile. So in INSCYD, we do have this as part of your profile, which is a graph which shows you now on the x-axis the running power based on Stryd. On the left y-axis, the kilocalorie combusted. Green is from fat, red is from carbohydrates. And on the right y-axis, you also see the carbohydrates in grams per hour, because for most people that's a most easier, more applicable parameter, because you can just look on your power bar or gel or energy gel and see, okay, that's whatever 22 grams of carbohydrates per serving. Okay. If you are a little bit more, I wouldn't say old school, but if you are a little bit more, have a classic approach to training intensities, for example, you come from a lab-based background and you do measure lactate in lab or field, then for example, you might have a training zone or you might want to have a training zone which is based on not fat or carbohydrate combustion, but more based on, lactate levels. So you can do that. You can just define a training zone, for example, in this case, tempo training at 3 millimoles of lactate, and INSCYD will give you the precise power output. And here I've chosen on the physiological conditions, you can see in this case, this is 70% of the VO2max or 93% of the threshold power. So you can always see, how does that relate to my other metrics? And then of course we have threshold training, so on and so forth. Another example, how you can use that, when you want to do very precise interval training. And now what I did here is we added to the power, we added a pace that you would have under standardized conditions running on a road or on a track. Okay, so you can now have the pace and the power, and you can even design it almost like a workout builder. You can go in and say, okay, I want to know which intensity should I run to reach 100% VO2max power over a course of 4 minutes. That's what you see in the upper left zone here. It could be 4 minutes, could be 3 minutes, 5. It's entirely up to you. You can design whatever you want. Okay. If you, for example, standard interval training is 4 minutes duration, you can go in, design that, and you can see in this case target power is 401 watts. And in this athlete, this is 3 minutes, 13 seconds per kilometer. And then you can also see again where's the power coming from, aerobic versus anaerobic energy contribution. And the 2.0 here is the rate of lactate accumulation. So this is telling you how quickly you're accumulating lactate during these 4 minutes. So here, that's 2 millimoles per minute, which means after 4 minutes, you're arriving at approximately 8 millimoles, okay? But what is maybe even more important in interval training, and we do have a, I think, fairly good webinar about that, and I would encourage you to review that if you haven't done yet. What determines the effect of your interval training, maybe even more than your correct power output, is the duration and the intensity of the recovery. And that's what you see below here. What we have here is a training zone, which is basically your power output at which you can recover the fastest. Okay, so one very important metric in INSCYD, what has been proven very useful across different sports, is basically visualized here. The gray curve shows your ability to combust lactate in millimoles per minute, to get rid of the lactate that has been accumulated, to get rid of that as a function of power. And you can see here the apex of this curve, the maximum, the plateau is at 240 watts. And that's basically exactly what you did see here in this training zone. Okay, so you can not only set very precise intensities for the on phase of an interval, and you can define the duration or the intensity of the duration or the distance actually of that interval individually. You can also individually decide on the recovery intensity. Okay, and this is based here. And the last one, which I wanted to share, which is highly important for a lot of athletes, is how do you approach race day? What do you actually do on race day? How do you decide the intensity for a marathon or a half marathon? And that's also possible. And you can even fine tune that. And it's based on your individual physiology, on your performance. You can also take in your diet. You can see here, you can select different, diets with different contents of carbohydrates. And you can decide how much you want to fuel. And based on your metabolic profile, your individual profile, how much glycogen you have stored, so how much energy actually stored as form as glycogen in your muscles, how much you combust, how much you fuel during the race, which is something you might want to do in training, right? Train to be able to fuel more, to replenish more carbohydrates as you run. Based on all these settings, you can basically ask okay, what is my perfect power output for a marathon to have the maximum speed, to have the maximum performance, basically without the risk of bonking, right? Without the risk of depleting carbohydrate before you see the finish line. And that's one other example here. And with that, I'm happy that we are quite on time and would like to open for questions.